And this idea that he was first and foremost an educationalist then found expression in the opening of the school St Enda's in Rathfarnham, formally opened by the President Patrick Hillery in 1979. And there was that dilemma. Joe Lee, a brilliant, perceptive historian in the 1970s and indeed onwards, referred to this danger in relation to Pearse, the idea that there was a danger he would fall victim to mindless condemnation, as in the past he had fallen victim to mindless idolatry. This idea that there needed to be an engagement with what he represented, and education, whilst being a hugely important part of his contribution and his career, was only one part of that. And even the President of Ireland before that, President Childers, Erskine Childers in 1974, who'd been called out from school in 1922 to be told that his father, Erskine Sr., had been executed by a firing squad during the depths of the Civil War. Erskine Childers, by then President, writes to Cosgrave and says, "I'm fed up with opening War of Independence museums. They're full of guns." And he referred to the opening of the Sean Tracy Museum in Tipperary, Sean Tracy being a celebrated War of Independence veteran from that part of the country. He said, "What about those who lived and worked for Ireland? We are far too preoccupied with those who died for Ireland." And again, that kind of rhetoric has been replicated in more recent times. So those difficulties are undoubtedly there in the 1980s, and in the 70s and the 80s, those discomforts. And you can see them still profoundly relevant in 1991 for the 75th anniversary of the Easter Rising. The idea that this was an occasion of awkwardness in relation to official remembrance, that many people had to challenge the government on its lack of programme, on its lack of engagement. What Declan Kyberd referred to as the elephant of revolutionary forgetfulness. Pat Wallace even suggested, as director of the museum, that he was asked to remove the War of Independence guns from the National Museum because they were sending out the wrong signal. These are the kind of things that did happen during that period of the Troubles, and you can see how it impacted on that question of remembrance. There's also a proliferation of accounts of this period that suggest that those who are writing them are not so much concerned with what happened during that period, but with what they wished had happened during that period. Tom Garvin emphasised, for example, how important it was in 1922 that the moderates, as he termed them, triumphed, that there was, as a result, a successful state in its wake. The extremists are presented as those Republicans who saw their republicanism as a faith, and they did often see it as a faith. Mary McSweeney wrote to Eamon de Valera during the Civil War and used precisely that word. We hold the Republic as a living faith. But what Garvin suggested in 1991 at the time of the 75th anniversary was that this was about seeing the Republic as a moral transcendental entity that had no basis in real life. So again, you can see those discomforts and you can see some of the reactions to them and the fashioning of a particular type of narrative around that time. But things do certainly change. And they change, you could argue, largely as a result of the peace process, but they also change, I suppose, simply because of the passage of time. And that is always going to be a fundamental reference fundamental relevance to commemoration. There was a very interesting reaction in 2001, for example, to the Mountjoy 10 episode, the decision by the Fianna Fáil government of that era to disinter the bodies of 10 men who had been executed during the War of Independence, including the most famed of them, Kevin Barry, the 18-year-old UCD student who was executed in 1920, to disinter them and to reinter them in Glasnevin Cemetery with a state funeral. And this caused apoplexy on the part of some cultural commentators and journalists and historians, though sometimes they kept their counsel in relation to this. The idea, in the words of one journalist, that this would give succour to those who wanted us to believe that the only difference between a patriot and a terrorist is the passage of time. That was the observation of Fintan O'Toole in the Irish Times in 2001. And he also invoked the rawness of the 9/11 Twin Tower attacks in America to talk about how distasteful this whole idea of celebrating terrorists was. And that word was widely used. You also, though, had a very warm response on the part of those who assembled and applauded this funeral cortege as it made its way towards Glasnevin. And Cardinal Cathal Daly, who gave a thunderous oration in the pro-cathedral at the funeral mass and excoriated the failure to deliver on the social promises of the 1916 generation. So a different emphasis there. You also had a degree of pride being expressed that seemed to differ from that existed in the 1980s. There were two opinion polls that I found very revealing. I'm not suggesting these are scientific, but they certainly were covered by both the Irish Independent and the Sunday Business Post in relation to attitudes to the 1916 Rising on the part of the Irish public. 65% had expressed pride at the time of the 75th anniversary in 1991. That had increased to 80% expressing pride in the 1916 Rising at the time of its 90th anniversary in 2006. And that was also the occasion for the reintroduction of the military parade. That was also the occasion for Fianna Fáil and Bertie Ahern as Taoiseach to work in cahoots with the President of Ireland at that time, Mary McAleese, in relation to pulling the green rug from under Sinn Féin. And there was a concern at that time about Sinn Féin and the inroads it was making into the Republic. And the idea was that Sinn Féin were not going to be allowed to wrap this particular green flag around themselves on the 90th anniversary of the 1916 Rising. So the awkwardness of 1991 was replaced in 2006 with the reintroduction of the military parade. Now, of course, that was balanced because there had to be a peace process balance. And the balance involved commemorating the Battle of the Somme for the first time officially on the part of the state in 2006. So again, that was the idea of a shared history, and that was a phrase that Mary McAleese had often used, the idea of shared histories and different sets of memories, and this was a way, it seemed, of squaring that particular circle. And there was some rancorous debate about the appropriateness of this. Sometimes I felt that descended into cartoon history, the idea of the revolutionary generation as being black or white, or being debated in black and white terms, the idea of democracy versus dictatorship, or freedom versus tyranny, or treachery versus bravery, or sectarianism versus inclusiveness. And again, you can see all of those particular labels being used. Mary McAleese, as president, also opened a seminar or a conference in Cork on the 90th anniversary of the Rising, and she referred in glowing terms to the 1916 Rising architects as being progressive internationalists, as being broad-minded, as being tolerant, as being visionaries, as being people who would have been delighted with Ireland's joining the European Economic Community in the early 1970s. So again, you can see the extent to which present political needs are being met by the use of this commemoration of the revolutionary period. And yet there was a debate. The historian in Cork, Gabriel Doherty, referred to it as a prolonged and extensive debate about 1916 and its legacy. It produced some very interesting research and literature. It was also an opportunity to rebut the assumption that the historical analysis of 1916 and that era was in any way complete.